I mean, when you started reporting the story, when you got the assignment to do it, tell us about your movements. I mean, how did you get access? Where were you able to go? It's a difficult, it's a difficult story to write. It's a difficult thing to figure out how much actual information you could get.
Yeah, well, and as I say, the islands are a military, or India is a democracy, but those islands are kind of an exception. I don't think there's democratic representation, but certainly they're run by an appointed governor. There's not, and the police there and the army and so on are notably unfriendly to journalists. I mean, I experienced that in the past. So I knew that I had to go in quietly, I didn't declare myself to anybody. So I stayed in a small backpacker's guest house. I worked with a guy that I knew on the islands who's supremely good and totally connected, but I stayed away from authority because the moment I spoke to any of them, I'd have been kicked off the islands again. And I stayed there for, I think 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, something like that. Just painstakingly reconstructing John's time on the islands. He'd done 4 trips there, just going everywhere and trying to work out his process, his mind, but also, I mean, he'd been all over the place. So it was a real kind of detective story. Why did he go here? Why did he go here? A real clue actually was a calendar that he left in the same backpackers hostel that I was staying in. The barman showed it to me one night. And it was a calendar that John had made with, of his photographs. And they were a record of where he'd been. And, there were some quite odd places to go. So, one was right next to a Jaroa reserve. It's another tribe on the island. The only reason to go there is to meet the Jaroa. Another one was he'd been to 2 or 3 villages, which are the nearest jumping off points to the Sentinel Island. So through this and retracing his steps and looking at receipts of other backpacker hostels that he'd been to, stuff like that, I could place him, and then I could talk to people in those areas who'd met him and kind of work out his thought process, his planning process, for this expedition. It was really slow detective work, but I love that kind of work actually. I can't sleep when I'm on a story like that.
Well, it was really interesting to read about the lengths that John went to, Mr. Chau, to prepare himself. Because I know as a reader, when I read the quick news stories, I guess I imagined this almost impulsive decision for this kid who went and got some fishermen to drop him off by the island and just got killed. But that wasn't the case at all. This had been a lifelong ambition. He had done all kinds of things to prepare himself, starting back in the U.S. in the Midwest. Didn't I read he went to something in Missouri to get training and advice about how to convert indigenous tribes? I mean, he went through, like, I would say almost years of preparation, right?
John had been on this mission for about a decade.
Yeah.
Of course, he rewrote his own story kind of with hindsight. So he would trace it back even further to when he read Robinson Crusoe and going to Hawaii with his family. But he had a break with his father when he was about 17. His father, who was a doctor, got busted for selling opioids to 2 undercover DEA agents in large quantities without good reason. It was a family disgrace. John's 2 older siblings, a brother and sister, had followed their father into medicine, and John might well have done the same, but at that moment, John took a sharp left turn into climbing a lot of mountains and radical Christianity. And he, not long after that, or around about the same time, he did a mission to Mexico, part of his, with his school. And he came back from that with a very simple idea of what would be the ultimate, and quite quickly zeroed in on Sentinel Island. And for 10 years, really, he was, in a sense, preparing for this trip. Physically, a lot of his father told me that all the hikes he was doing, he always saw as preparation for John to go there. As I say, he'd been to the islands 3 or 4 times before. He had done missionary work in other areas, but again, it was all kind of prep. You're right, he went to a kind of military boot camp, which is a bizarre place where other missionaries would sort of leap out of the woods and threaten you, and you had to try and communicate. He'd been to a linguistics school. I think he'd done that twice, actually, to try and learn how to pick up a language of which you know not a word and don't understand the grammar. The whole thing, his whole life was directed at this one point, at this island. And so, you know, people said, you know, after the news broke when he died, oh, what a crazy thing to do, that's suicidal. John was the opposite of that. He was meticulous. You know, he was cautious, actually. He did an enormous amount of reading. He couldn't possibly have been more prepared. You know, his error, obviously, was never really to imagine how he might appear to people that he was approaching. But in terms of his own prep and his knowledge and his reading, he dedicated his life to this. Yeah.
Well, here's a question actually from when I see it, it's popped up a couple times from somebody who's watching, and it sort of segues in. So why don't you address it now? Sure. Somebody is asking, would you label John as mentally ill? That's a question.
Well, no, I wouldn't. I mean, he was not by the usual definitions. He was absolutely rational. But you sort of get into an area of how do you classify a fanatic? You know, he was absolutely driven and monofocused, which is bordering on fanaticism, I suppose. But he wasn't mentally unwell. He was perfectly rational. He moved rationally. He had a purpose and he moved towards it systematically and methodically. You can question that purpose, and you know, from a sort of safety point of view, or also from an ethical point of view. Should he have been doing that? You know, that's absolutely valid. But to say that he's wrong is not to say that he was crazy. What he was doing was radical for sure, but he wasn't crazy.
I mean, I remember reading in your piece, in the journal excerpts, that there's this scene where, and I think you just referenced it as well, but it's very kind of, there's a pathos to it, because he's sort of writing over and over again, I don't want to die. And he says that he is watching the sunset and he's crying. I think it was, in fact, the night before he died.
Yeah, it was.
You know, it does seem like somehow he did understand what he was doing and he knew how it was going to end. And I think you had mentioned at some point that you felt that the journal was, that he was sort of aware as he was writing it that people would be reading it later as a document. So there's that question of how, you know, if people are writing a journal in that way, it's sort of, how authentic is it at that point? You know, like how do we decide that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and he left his journal with the fisherman who'd taken him out there with instructions that they pass it back to his kind of support group back in the States. So yeah, this was definitely a document for posterity for John. And on the pages, he definitely didn't want to show any doubt. You know, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, John is not unique in a sense. There's a lot of these guys, missionary bros, who are pursuing that lonely path into the jungle to meet the uncontacted tribe. The story never varies, and very often they don't come back alive. Mm-hmm. You know, John was hardly the first guy to do this. A lot of his heroes had done exactly the same thing and had also been killed. So it's the story's mapped out for him, and there's no room in that story for doubt. You know, whether John had doubt in his own mind about what he was, not just what he was doing, but, you know, proper doubt in faith. Was God going to save him at this point? I think he must have done, right? But he doesn't say so. He holds fast to that. And that, I guess, is what I mean by immaturity in a way. I mean, it sounds unkind, but put it this way, you don't get old suicide bombers, right? They're all young men. You know, after a certain point, you grow up and you think, maybe this isn't so smart. You know, you're not so linear. You're not so monofocused. And John, he just didn't quite have the, as I say, the way I think of it is the maturity to accept the personal humiliation that will come with failing to perform his mission. And instead, he kind of had to go through with it.